flying ostriches and yellow knights, evil buzzards and red knights. Mix them together and with a seemingly invincible pterodactyl, and you've got the makings of the successful Williams Electronics arcade game Joust. At a time when most successful flying games involved either asteroids or spaceships, this one stood out from the pack with its unique style of gameplay. What 1980s sci-fi movie was an influence on this game? What concept was a close second right behind flying ostriches? So put on a flappy face because we are going to talk about the history of Joust. The year is 1981 and designer John Newcomer had just started at Williams Electronics. Mr. Newcomer had been employed as an inventor and toy designer for a company in Chicago, but was fascinated with the new breed of electronic entertainment. He had worked on LED handheld versions of some of the most popular arcade games, including Centipede and Space Invaders, but was just not satisfied with the results. Due to proximity, he gravitated towards Williams Electronics, which was also based out of Chicago. His first task after being hired was to create a treasure chest, which was a folder filled with game ideas and concepts that any programmer could go through. His two favorites were War of the Worlds, which was based upon the popular book and movie, and the other one was Joust. At the time, Williams did not have the technology available to do what Mr. Newcomer had envisioned, so the idea stayed on the shelf. Joust could be done on current Defender hardware with the current joystick designs. Teaming up with programmer Bill Futzenreuter, they decided to use the existing Defender hardware since at its core, Joust was going to be a flying game.
I quickly made a list of everything that could fly, from planes to Da Vinci contraptions, squirrels, vampires, superheroes, birds, and so on.
Mr. Newcomer was very close to creating a superhero arcade game, but felt the appeal would be lost on female gamers. He kept gravitating towards birds, as he had been a fan of mythology, science fiction, and the 1980s cult classic Flash Gordon. In the movie, Prince Voltan and his army of winged birdmen become allies of Flash Gordon as they take down the evil Ming the Merciless. When designing the game, he had an epiphany when he realized that by having the player press the button every time the wings flapped, they could control the speed. He felt this would strengthen the emotional connection between the player and their giant steed. This was the early 1980s and you had a flying game with no shooting involved, which proved to be a huge gamble, but in the end it paid off. Since you constantly have to press the flap button in order to fly, it's more of a game against gravity than anything else. The game allows for two players simultaneously with the second player riding a giant stork, something Mr. Newcomer was not happy with. The programming team had only 96K of memory for the entire game, which limited the sounds, animation, and size of the graphics. They only had a palette of 16 colors to use for the entire game. To get the animation of the flying creatures just right, they used the book Animals in Motion as reference. Since memory was limited, Mr. Newcomer had prioritized the sound that the birds make when they flap their wings. Another thing they added as a nod to the Roadrunner cartoons was the sound your ostrich makes when he screeches to a halt, similar to the sound when Roadrunner stops running. Joust is a simultaneous two-player arcade game released by Williams Electronics in 1982. You take control of the Yellow Knight, who is armed with a lance as you attempt to stop the other knights who are riding the evil vultures. Since there is no shooting involved in this game, you have to attack your opponents from a higher jousting point to destroy the knight and his vulture. Once you do this, an egg will fall onto one of the platforms down below. You must destroy the eggs before they hatch and release new, more powerful knights to contend with. If you and your opponent attack each other on the same plane, you will bounce off without doing any damage. The three types of knights are the Bounder, which is the red knight, the Hunter, which is the white knight, and Shadow Lord, which is the blue knight. As you progress through the game, platforms will start to crumble, making it much more difficult. Be careful because there is a lava troll who will come up out of the lava and try to pull you in. one last thing to contend with is the dreaded pterodactyl. This was added so the players would hurry up and finish the level. Mr. Newcomer had designed the pterodactyl to be indestructible, but one day, right before the game was finished, unbeknownst to him, someone had modified the look of the creature, and in doing so, created an opening for it to be killed. The shifting of one tiny pixel is all it took. The game gradually gets harder and harder with more and more enemies filling up the screen. Eventually, you will come to the egg wave, in which you have to grab all the enemy eggs before they hatch. The game repeats indefinitely, with the difficulty getting harder and harder. For an early 1980s arcade game, the graphics and animation are excellent. The sound effects, while sparse, are distinct and do a great job of conveying what's going on around you. The use of the flat button was ingenious, and the simulated gravity is really well done. It has a huge strategic element to the gameplay. Joust was one of the first successful two-player simultaneous arcade games. It was also one of the first arcade games to ship with a battery backup system. This allowed the high scores to be saved if the machine was ever unplugged. The game shipped in two flavors, the standard upright and the much rarer cocktail version. The game was a monster success, selling over 25,000 cabinets. The game was so successful that it even spawned a pinball game the following year. The unique thing about it was that it featured simultaneous two-player pinball action. Unlike traditional pinball machines, this was shipped in a cocktail format with a divided play area and players on opposite ends of the playfield. There were only a little over 400 of these ever made, so they are extremely rare. In 1986, Joust 2 Electric Boogaloo was released. This feels more like a complete game than the first one, with much better graphics, animation, and level design. One big change is the use of a vertical screen, which puts an emphasis on vertical flying. In the game, it's now possible to transform into a Pegasus, which does have a distinct feel over your ostrich. The ostrich is lighter and has better maneuverability, while the Pegasus is heavier and more powerful. The backgrounds have also been increased as far as detail goes, with 35 distinct backdrops at 101 different levels. There are a number of other enemies to contend with, including a bat and robots. The game is a lot of fun in my opinion, but for whatever reason it just wasn't that big of a hit. Only 1,000 units of the game were shipped. The original game was a massive hit, so of course the conversions were going to flow like wine. By my count, there were over 30 officially licensed versions of this game, and that's not counting the various bootlegs and clones. Now, I'm not going to cover all of them, but I will cover a couple of highlights and a couple of lowlights. To be honest, most of the conversions turned out pretty good, but there were a couple of stinkers in the bunch.
Got it. Joust.
presents Joust, the video game where buzzard men battle ostrich men. The graphics go beyond your wildest dreams.
The first one we're looking at is the Spectrum version, and while the backgrounds sort of resemble Joust, the actual character graphics do not. To be honest, with the way the main character turned out, it should have been called The Revenge of Kentucky Fried Chicken. There is also a lot of flicker going on and loose, slippery controls. Next up is the Apple II version, which to be honest is not too bad aside from the odd color scheme. If this game would have come out 30 years before, I would have thought this was where Dr. Seuss got the idea for green eggs and ham. The graphics and animation are nicely done, but the sound is just atrocious. At least it plays reasonably well. The Atari 2600 version, while lacking in detail, more than makes up for it in speed and playability. The trusty but perhaps rusty 2600 does a pretty good job with the sound, and overall it's a really good representation of the arcade game. The Atari 7800 port was one of the 11 launch titles for the system, and it's a fantastic conversion. Nicely detailed sprites with decent sound and pitch-perfect playability. One of the better arcade conversions on the system. One of the best home conversions, in my opinion, would have to be the Atari Lynx version. The graphics are nicely detailed despite the small size, and the sounds are sampled straight from the arcade game. One of the absolute best arcade conversions on the system. The game has been re-released numerous times over the years, including Williams Arcade Classics for the PC, the Xbox Live Network, and the PlayStation Network. And that wraps up the history of Joust. If you grew up in the 1980s, chances are you tried this game, and chances are you really enjoyed it. It offered a unique gameplay experience with simultaneous two-player action. If for whatever reason you haven't tried this game, give it a shot. You'll be glad you did. Let me give a big shout out to Slopes Game Room for providing some voiceover work on this video. Be sure to check out Daniel's excellent channel in the link below if you haven't done so already. You can always support me on Patreon at the link below, and also make sure to like, share, and subscribe to my content, that is if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching.